Okay, so as I teased the lesson, the topic today is catastrophe, and it is taken from Genesis chapter 47, verses 13 through 21. It is my ongoing personal journey into the life of Joseph, and this particular lesson I thought was pretty apropos to the times. So I'm going to let the Bible speak, and then we'll talk about it. Genesis chapter 47, verses 13 through 21. The time eventually came when there was no food anywhere. The famine was very bad. Egypt and Canaan alike were devastated by the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan to pay for the distribution of food. He banked the money in Pharaoh's palace, and then when the money from Egypt and Canaan had run out, the Egyptians came to Joseph. "Food! Give us food! Are you going to watch us die right in front of you? The money is all gone," Joseph said. "Bring your livestock. I'll trade you food for livestock since your money's run out." So they brought Joseph their livestock, and he traded them food for horses, sheep, cattle, and donkeys. He got them through that year in exchange for all of their livestock. When that year was over, the next year rolled around and they were back saying, "Master, it's no secret to you that we're broke. Our money's gone and we've traded you all our livestock. We've nothing left to barter with but our bodies and our farms. What use are our bodies and our land if we stand here and starve to death right in front of you? Please trade us food for our bodies and our land. We'll be slaves to Pharaoh and give up our land. All we ask is seed for survival, just enough to live on and keep the farms alive." So Joseph bought up all the farms in Egypt for Pharaoh. Every Egyptian sold his land. The famine was that bad. And that's how Pharaoh ended up owning all the land, and the people ended up as slaves. The image in front of you, who can forget 9/11? Who can forget Pearl Harbor or the sinking of the Titanic? Catastrophes leave us off balance. Sometimes it leaves us even a little bewildered or confused. So consider the catastrophe of Joseph's generation. The Bible just that we read said the time eventually came when there was no food anywhere. The famine was very bad. Egypt and Canaan alike were devastated by the famine. So now, as you've been following along with me in our study of Joseph, during the time that Joseph was struggling to reconcile with his brothers and eventually with his family, he's also navigating a worldwide catastrophe. It had been 2 years since the last drop of rain. And I'm assuming that at this point in time in Egypt, the sky is just endlessly blue, and the sun, unfortunately, is relentlessly hot. Animal carcasses probably litter the ground, and there is no hope at all on the horizon. The land at this point in time is turning into a dust bowl. No rain meant no farming. No farming meant no food. And when people appealed to Pharaoh for help, he said, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says, you do." That's what it says in Genesis chapter 41, verse 55. So Joseph was facing a catastrophe of global proportions. Yet, contrast the description of the problem with the outcome. Because years later, after the famine has subsided, the country is restored, people get back to normal, the people told Joseph in Genesis chapter 47, verse 25, "You've saved our lives. Master, we're grateful and glad to be slaves to Pharaoh." So the people remained calm. a society that was ripe for anarchy, actually thanked the government rather than attacking it. So imagine that. Thanking the government instead of just burning it all down. If Joseph ever taught a postdoctoral crisis management course, he probably included the words that he had told his brothers. God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. Genesis chapter 45, verses 5 through 7. Joseph began and he ended his crisis assessment with references to God. God preceded the famine. God would outlive the famine. God was all over the famine. So for Joseph, it was God, famine, God. So how would you describe your own personal crisis? The economy, the economy, the economy. Unemployment, unemployment, unemployment. Pandemic, pandemic, pandemic. I mean, do you ever find yourself reciting your woes more naturally than you do heaven's strengths? If so, it's no wonder that life is tough. You're assuming God isn't in the catastrophe. You're assuming that he's just not there, but he is. Even a famine was fair game for God's purpose. And I want you to consider an example. The little girl's name is Isabel. She spent the first 3.5 years of her precious little life in a Nicaraguan orphanage. She had no mother, she had no father, and she had no promise of either. And as with all orphans, odds of adoption diminish with time. The older they get, the less adoptable they seem to be. And every passing month decreased Isabel's chance of being placed in a home. But then a door slammed on her finger. She was following the other little children out in the playground area when a screen door closed on her hand, and pain shot up her arm and a scream echoed across the entirety of the playground. Now, why would God let something like that happen? Why would a benevolent, omnipotent God permit an innocent little girl with more than her fair share of challenges to feel even now more pain? Maybe he was calling for the attention of a man named Ryan Schnoke. He was an American would-be father who was sitting in the playroom nearby. And he and his wife, Christina, had been trying to adopt a child for months. No other adult was around to help Isabel, so Ryan walked over, picked her up, and comforted her. Several months later, when Ryan and Christina were close to giving up, Ryan remembered Isabel and resolved with his wife to try one more time. This time, the adoption succeeded, and little Isabel is now growing up in a happy, healthy home with the Schnoke family. So like a finger in the door, God doesn't manufacture pain, but he certainly puts it to good use. It says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 15, God is the blessed controller of all things. The prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 55, verse 9, said, his ways are higher than our ways. Paul, writing to the church in Rome, in Romans chapter 11, verse 33, said, his judgments are unsearchable, and his paths are beyond tracing out. We can't always see what God is doing, but can't we assume that he's up to something good? I mean, Joseph did. He assumed that God was in the catastrophe, and then he faced it with a plan. His plan was collect grain during the good years and redistribute it during the bad years. And when the people ran out of food, he gave it to them in exchange for money first, livestock second, and then eventually their property. Then, after he had stabilized the economy, he gave the people a lesson in money management. And I'm paraphrasing Genesis chapter 47, verse 24. But basically, Joseph said, give 1/5 of what you make to Pharaoh and use the rest for farming and for eating. I mean, that plan could fit on an index card. I mean, it's not big. Save for 7 years, distribute for 7 years, manage carefully. I mean, could Joseph's response have been any simpler than that? But, could it have been any more boring? I mean, some flamboyance would have been nice. I mean, don't you think? I mean, a little bit of the Red Sea opening, like the children of Israel could eventually see when they leave Egypt. Or maybe Jericho's walls come tumbling down, or a dead man walking like Jesus raising Lazarus. I mean, wouldn't it have been so much better for Joseph to have this really snazzy presentation? But a dramatic crisis or a catastrophe requires, does it? A dramatic response? No, not always. I mean, we equate spirituality with high drama, like Paul raising the dead or Peter healing the sick. Yet for every Paul and for every Peter, there are dozens of Josephs. Men and women who are blessed, in this case, with the skills of administration. Steady hands through whom God serves and saves his people. I mean, consider that Joseph never raised the dead, but he kept people from dying. He never healed a sick person, but he kept sickness from spreading. He made a plan and he stuck with it. And because he did, the nation that he was leading survived. He triumphed with a very calm but very methodical plan. In the days leading up to the war with Germany, the British government commissioned a series of posters. The idea of these posters was to capture encouraging slogans on paper and then to distribute them throughout the countryside. Capital letters in this really distinct typeface were used, and a simple two-color format was selected. The only graphic on any of these posters was the crown of King George VI. The first poster was distributed in September of 1939, and you're looking at it. It says, "Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory." And not long after that poster was published, they published a second one. And you're looking at that. And it says, "Freedom is in peril. Defend it with all your might." Remember, they're in the midst of World War II. So these are encouraging slogans and posters that were plastered throughout the countryside and the cities. They were everywhere. And these two posters appeared even in pubs, in stores, and in restaurants. They were just, the word is ubiquitous. They're like everywhere. Like, where's Waldo? You see Waldo like everywhere. That's these posters. You could not miss seeing one of these posters because it was designed to encourage the populace. A third poster was actually created, but it was never distributed. They made actually 2.5 million copies of this poster. But it wasn't until some 60 years later when a bookstore owner in northeast England discovered one in a box of old books that he had purchased at an auction. And you're reading now what it read. "Keep calm and carry on." The poster bore that same crown, the same style of the first two posters, and it was never released to the public. It had been held in reserve for an extreme catastrophe, such as an invasion by Germany. The bookstore owner framed it and hung it on the wall, and it became so popular that the bookstore began producing these identical images, and putting them on like coffee mugs and postcards and posters. I don't know if he got sued for patent infringement or trademark infringement. I don't know what happened to that guy. But they were everywhere. Again, ubiquitous. Everyone, it seems, appreciated the reminder from an earlier generation to just keep calm and carry on. And of all the Bible heroes, Joseph is the one most likely to have hung a copy of that poster in his office. He indwelt the world of ledgers and flowcharts and end-of-year reports and tabulations and calculations. I mean, day after day he was doing this, month after month, year after year. Can you imagine trying to manage a granary to feed a country and beyond for 7 years? That would take a lot of skill and a lot of planning. But he kept a cool head. And he carried on. And you know what? So can you. You can't control the weather. You aren't in charge of the economy. You can't unwreck your car or cure COVID, but you can map out a strategy. Remember, God is in the catastrophe. Ask him to give you maybe an index card-sized plan and maybe 2 or 3 steps that you can take even today. And then seek counsel from someone who has maybe faced a similar challenge. Ask friends to pray. Look for resources. But most importantly, make a plan. Management guru Jim Collins has some interesting words on this very subject. He and a colleague, his name was Morton T. Hansen, studied leadership during turbulent times. And they looked at 20,000 different companies. They sifted through reams of data in search of an answer to this question. Why, in uncertain times, do some companies thrive while others do not? Here is their conclusion. Quote, successful leaders are not more creative. They are not more visionary. They're not more charismatic. They're not more ambitious. They're not more blessed by luck. They're not more risk-seeking. They're not more heroic. And they're not more prone to making big, bold moves. End quote. Well, okay, then what set apart these companies that thrived during a catastrophe and those that didn't? Quote, they all led their teams with a surprising method of self-control in an out-of-control world. You see, church, in the end, it's not flashy and it's not flamboyant that's going to survive. It is instead those with steady hands and sober minds, people like Roald Amundsen. In 1911, Mr. Amundsen headed up a Norwegian team in the race to the South Pole. Robert Scott, on the other hand, directed a team from England. The two expeditions faced identical challenges and identical terrain. They endured the same freezing temperatures and unforgiving environment. They had equal access to the technology and to the equipment of its time. Yet Amundsen, that guy, and his team reached the South Pole 34 days before Mr. Scott did. And so he was asked, well, what made the difference? Well, the difference was planning. Amundsen was a tireless strategist. He had a clear strategy of traveling 15 to 20 miles a day. Good weather, 15 to 20 miles a day. Bad weather, 15 to 20 miles a day. No more, no less. Always 15 to 20 miles a day. Scott, by contrast, was irregular. He would push his team to exhaustion during the good weather and then just would completely shut it all down during the bad weather. So these two men had completely different philosophies and consequently completely different outcomes. Amundsen won the race without losing a single man. Scott lost not only the race, but he also lost his life and the lives of all of the members of his team on their return to base camp, which was some 150 miles away, but tragically it was only 11 miles from the next checkpoint. All because he lacked a plan. Now, we might prefer a miracle for our catastrophe. I mean, maybe we'd rather see the bread multiplied and return to normal without masks and social distancing and isolation. Or maybe we'd like to see the stormy sea turn glassy calm in like a snap of a finger. And maybe God will do that. I don't know. Then again, he may tell you, I'm with you. I can use this for good. Now let's make a plan. Trust God to help you. God's sovereignty does not negate our personal responsibility. It's just the opposite. It empowers it. When we trust God, we think more clearly and react more decisively, like Nehemiah. He said in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 9, we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. And just by way of brief Reader's Digest background, do you remember what this is from? Nehemiah was the cupbearer for King Artaxerxes. He begs the king to give him leave of absence to go restore the walls of Jerusalem. The king says, cool, fine. In fact, here's letters, here's money, here's my checkbook. Do what you need to do. And so Nehemiah is now overjoyed to go back to his home and reconstruct the walls of Jerusalem. But there were some people in Jerusalem that didn't really like that plan. And they were trying to injure and harm and kill Nehemiah. So Nehemiah came up with a plan. Some were builders, some were not, and they worked in shifts. But every single person that worked on that wall would construct with one hand, and they had their hand on their sword on the other. And that's what this is saying. It is saying, we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. It was a threat from his own people. So reduced to a nutshell, what Nehemiah said is like we prayed and we posted. And stated differently, it's like we trust and we act. Trust God to do what you can't, and obey God to do what you can. I mean, don't let the catastrophe or a pandemic paralyze you. Don't let the sadness and isolation overwhelm you. Don't let the fear of infection or a second wave intimidate you. To do nothing is the wrong thing. To do something is the right thing, and to believe is the highest thing. In the words of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29, there are secrets the Lord our God has not revealed to us, but these words that he has revealed are for us and our children to obey forever. In other words, church, keep calm and carry on. I just so happened to read an article this morning. I wasn't looking for this. And it was quoting the CEO for American Airlines, where finally, for the first time, American Airlines was having kind of a sit-down, but probably a Zoom-type meeting with investors, wanting to know where this airline is going to go. He said 84% of our business has not come back. And the stockholders are reeling, and he believes that it's not going to return back to normal in terms of airfare and passenger rates until 2024. That is not a good message to give to your stockholders. But here's what he said, and he quoted from Winston Churchill. He said, I don't think the end is coming. I don't even think we're at the beginning of the end. What I do think is we may be at the end of the beginning. And maybe, church, that's where we're at with this COVID stuff. Listening to the San Diego County Board of Supervisors last Friday, it's like, well, if we don't get this under control, we're going to go back to the red zone. You know, the Candyland kind of stuff we've got going on in California. Your red, your purple, your chartreuse, your rainbow. I don't know what the colors are. Red one is the bad one. Purple one is the one that we're in now. And so I don't know where we're at with this COVID. You hear people talking about a second wave. You hear people talking about having maybe a shot for it, a vaccination at the end of this year, or maybe it's September of next year. You can talk to any scientist and get pretty much whatever you want to hear from that scientist, and they are absolutely sincere about what they believe. So we don't know. So I don't think this is the end of times. I don't think it's the beginning of the end of times. But like Churchill said, maybe we might be at the end of the beginning. I don't know. But what I do know, church, is if we do not have a plan, and if we do not communicate to others that we have a plan, that this COVID stuff is not going to destroy us as a church family, then we need to get one and broadcast that to other people to give them hope. I don't know about you, but so many people just are hopeless. And there's no end in sight. I remember thinking distinctly in March, the 16th of March, oh, well, this isn't probably any worse than the flu. And it'll go away and we'll return back to normal in, I'll give it plenty of time, May. May rolls around, nada. June, July, you've lived it. But church, as Christians, as believers, we don't know everything that God is doing. And so it requires an element of trust. But we just don't trust and hope. Like playing golf. For me, I like to play golf. I don't play it as frequently as I like. But my golf theory is hit it and hope. I hope it'll land in the fairway. I hope it'll land on the green. That's my strategy. Hit it and hope. That might be fine for occasional round of golf, but it's not so fine for Christians, and it's not so fine for a church. We're not just hitting it and hoping. We're trusting, but in trusting, we also need to do what we can. So put together a plan. Curtis and I and the other leaders, we've tried to put together a plan here to address whatever those contingencies might be. And so we all need to do the same. Because if we can communicate to somebody that we have a plan and we have a God, and we kind of know at least generally where we're going with this, at least that gives them some hope. But sometimes I think we just think, we're just going to bunker down, we'll get through this, and someday we'll turn back to normal. I don't know. Not sure. But I'm confident of this. Joseph, because he remained calm and had a plan, got a country, a nation, through a 7-year famine. And they came out the other end, Pharaoh being much richer than he was before. Because Pharaoh at the time of the famine was the ruler. By the time the famine was over, he owned everything. All the cattle, all the grain, all the people, and all of their property. What an unbelievable outcome from a very dire beginning. And this could be the same. So church, I just want you to be encouraged this week. We don't know all the science. Some follow the science, some don't. And then we've got all the tumult associated with the election and whether ballots by mail are safe or not safe. And we've got all sorts of comments from either Biden or Trump. It can exhaust you. And that, coupled with isolation and depression, can drive you to places you do not want to go. So have a plan. Pray to God. Do what you can. You're not going to cure COVID, but you can talk to your neighbor. You can't cure this disease, but you can pay it forward at the grocery store. You can't fix the mess that we're in politically, but you might be able to give a word of encouragement to somebody that lives next to you. I don't know. It doesn't have to be much. Remember that Jesus took 2 loaves and 5 fish and fed roughly 15,000 people. And the amazing part of that story, to me, it's not the miracle. Remember, Jesus is with his disciples. And Jesus said, well, you need to feed all of them. Are you kidding me? Jesus, do you see how many people are out there? And it's getting dark. We can't feed them. So maybe what you need to do, Jesus, is you need to tell them to go into town, get yourself a meal, and then we can all resume tomorrow. Now, here are the apostles, the disciples, following Jesus, telling Jesus that he needs to dismiss them when Jesus is the solution standing right in front of them. That it didn't even occur to them, well, Jesus, you calm the raging seas. You raise people from the dead. Jesus, what do you think? It didn't even occur to them. And sometimes I can get so messed up in all the stuff that's going on that the last thing I think about doing is praying, when that should be our first reaction. Take a look at the front of your bulletin. Larry pointed this out to me this morning. A day without a prayer is like a swing without a child. Neither will hold all the joy that God intended. So church, have a plan and pray and see if you can't, in your own personal life and perhaps the lives of those around you, influence for good what appears to most to be a catastrophe, a pandemic, however you want to call it. I just want you to leave today encouraged, but to encourage you to make a plan. Because in doing that, I think we'll then get through this. So we've picked a song called, what is it, Justin? Thank you. What a friend we have in Jesus. Because we do. So let's not be like the disciples saying, well, I don't know how to feed all these people. Oh, Jesus, you're with us. Oh, you're the Son of God. Yeah, I think you can do that. So we have a friend. Let's talk to the friend. Let's pray to that friend. Let's pray to the Father and see if he can't help us initiate a plan to make a great change in the community in which we live. So let's stand. We're going to sing this song. If you have any prayer requests, you can pass them up now, and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand, please.